Now, world powers have failed to agree on a possible ceasefire for the rebel-held district of Eastern Ghouta in Syria. The UN Security Council has postponed a vote until Saturday, with Russia pushing for several amendments to an earlier draft resolution. RT's Caleb Maupin has the latest from New York.
Well, it's been a tough 2 days of rhetoric and negotiations. Now, it all relates to the district of Eastern Ghouta. That's east of Damascus, a suburb that is currently under the control of rebels and terrorists. It's an enclave, and at this point, the Syrian government is trying to retake the city in an anti-terror operation. Now, at this point, the anti-terror operation is being widely criticized by Western leaders. They're reporting that civilians are being killed. Recently, we even heard from U.S. President Donald Trump.
I will say what Russia and what Iran and what Syria have done recently is a humanitarian disgrace. I will tell you that. We're there for one reason. We're there to get ISIS and get rid of ISIS and go home. We're not there for any other reason. And we've largely accomplished our goal. But what those three countries have done to people over the last short period of time is a disgrace.
Now, we have heard from Russian officials regarding the situation there, and they have talked about concerns for civilian life, not wanting people to be harmed, but also pointing out that this is a fight against terrorists and that these terrorists are essentially using the civilians in the area as human shields. So we've also heard Russian officials point out that it's very interesting to hear such harsh criticism coming from the people who recently leveled the cities of Raqqa and Mosul.
We are appalled by the escalation of airstrikes in Eastern Ghouta.
Humanitarian disaster.
Systematic targeting of civilians.
This is hell on earth.
Ongoing slaughter of trapped civilians.
It's about the backers of the Syrian government as well, and we call on all their backers, including Russia, to ensure that this violence stops.
Civilian casualties are a fact of life.
In Iraq and in Syria, people are much more accepting that because it's their city being liberated, they understand what they were suffering.
Civilians will get caught in the crossfire, civilians will get hurt, civilians will get killed.
If you want to liberate your towns and cities, it comes at a price.
It's an unavoidable part of war. And commanders have to press on despite that. The responsibility for civilian casualties in Iraq and Syria lies with ISIS.
We are the good guys, and the innocent people on the battlefield know the difference.
Now, at this point, leaders of the international community are in full agreement that civilian life in Eastern Ghouta is very important and that the conditions are dire. All want to make sure that civilians are safe. However, there are clear disagreements among world leaders about who is to blame for the situation in Eastern Ghouta.
According to the United Nations, more than 300 civilians have been killed in Eastern Ghouta since the airstrikes intensified. The organization's Secretary General has described the situation there as hell on earth. Now, the Assad government has refused to scale back the operation, saying it is targeting terrorist groups that are using Ghouta as a base to shell residential areas of Damascus. 3 people were killed and 15 injured in the latest rebel assault on the Syrian capital on Friday. Political commentator John White says Western powers' reluctance to target terrorists in Ghouta will only add to the suffering of civilians.
Regime change propaganda has entered the realms of the fantastic, wherein groups such as Nusra Front and Jaish al-Islam, which is the dominant faction in Eastern Ghouta, these groups which adhere to the same ideology responsible for 9/11 and a whole litany of terrorist attacks, they're now being depicted as rebels, as partisans of Second World War repute, whereby the Syrian army made up of conscript soldiers drawn from every part of the multicultural and multi-religious mosaic of Syrian society. They're now being painted as a latter-day Waffen-SS, an army of occupation, rather than an army of liberation. So this narrative will continue as Syria comes closer to achieving its complete liberation. And the suffering of the civilians, which no one can deny, is being prolonged by this continued attempt to undermine the attempts of the Syrian government and its allies, particularly Russia, to liberate the country.
There is uproar over Syria's attacks on Eastern Ghouta. Al-Qaeda-linked terrorists that currently control that region have refused to come to a deal with the government over allowing in aid and medical evacuations, while in fact blocking civilians from leaving the area altogether. Added to the above, these very terrorists continue to attack Damascus and its surrounding areas as they have for so long. Yet there is no balanced conversation about all this at the United Nations, which puts all the blame on Syria and Russia while giving terrorists and their supporters carte blanche. Join me, Waqar Rizvi, as we discuss Eastern Ghouta tonight. Let's firstly go to our correspondent, Muhammad Ali, who is joining us live now from Aleppo. Muhammad, what is the latest you're hearing?
Yes, the latest about Eastern Ghouta and the situation in Damascus is that the terrorists over there continue to fire mortar shells attacking residential quarters in Damascus. Just hours ago, the terrorists of the Al-Nusra Front there and Faylaq al-Rahman launched a heavy rocket on Rukn al-Din, a residential quarter in Damascus, killing one civilian and injuring 60 others over there. Of course, this is not the only mortar attack that happened today. There are several others targeting all residential areas. One of the mortars, for example, targeted Al-Tub al-Jirahi hospital in Baghdad Street. You can imagine how much destruction is being caused by such attacks and how many civilians are being killed and injured over there. The suffering of civilians continue in Damascus and government-held areas because of the continued and increased attacks by the terrorists over there. Of course, the terrorists increased their attacks on Damascus with mortar shells following news that came that the Syrian army is sending reinforcements for fighting the Al-Nusra Front in Eastern Ghouta. Now, though Eastern Ghouta, east of Damascus, is a de-escalation zone, however, the Al-Nusra Front is a terrorist group and is not part of this de-escalation zone internationally. Thus, the army is trying to fight it. But the problem, according to many experts, is that there are many armed groups in Eastern Ghouta considered and regarded by the West as so-called moderate opposition groups who are fighting alongside the Al-Nusra Front, and they are increasing their mortar attacks, trying to stop the Syrian government from its offensive that is expected to take place for defeating the Al-Nusra Front and those groups fighting alongside it in Eastern Ghouta.
All right, Mohammed, we'll leave there at that, but of course, as always, we appreciate your reporting. Our guest for tonight's discussion, our editor-in-chief at theduran.com, Alexander Mercouris, who is joining us live from London. And we're also joined by the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy, Michael Lane, who is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Michael, I'll start with you. What do you make of the uproar over what is occurring in Eastern Ghouta, where such uproar has not existed when militants/terrorists have carried out these very atrocities against residents, for example, in Damascus?
Well, I think it's a matter of the scale which it's going on now. The area that we're talking about, East Ghouta, has some 400,000 civilian residents to it. As of, I think, the last count I saw, which may have been an hour or two ago, we're counting the deaths approaching upwards towards 500 people. If the bombing continues 24/7, which it's been going on for several days now, and if a ground assault is launched, then we're looking at a human catastrophic situation of really gargantuan proportions. And so I think that's why it's captured the world's attention. That's why it's captured the United Nations' attention. There doesn't seem to be any restraint at all going on by the Russians or the Syrians in terms of the bombing. And if it is indeed preparation for a ground assault, we are weeks away from humanitarian and medical aid getting in. And at this point, since most of the hospitals and medical facilities have been bombed, there's relatively little medical aid being rendered to the residents anyway. I think that, I recognize that when you're trying to vanquish and totally annihilate your enemy, that these kinds of things do happen. Very unfortunate that they are. But the grand scale of what's going on now, I think, is what's captured the world's attention.
Alexander, what do you make of that? Do Russia and Syria hold responsibility here for, as Michael said, and many people have been speaking about in the West, that that vital infrastructure has been apparently destroyed and civilians have been killed?
Well, I think responsibility is very widely shared. The first people the people who are primarily responsible, I would say, are the terrorist groups which are based in this area. And these are groups, some of them, which are aligned with Al-Qaeda, and which, of course, adopt its ideology. And it is a very ruthless and implacable ideology. And the suggestion, the proposal which has been made, is that they withdraw from this area, and that way it can then function as the kind of de-escalation zone that it was agreed that it should be. But if we come back to the question of scale, this is something that's always discussed in these contexts when the Syrians are attacking areas where jihadist groups are based. Of course, when we saw the same thing happen in Mosul, where Daesh was based, and also in Raqqa, where Daesh was also based, none of these things, none of this question of scale was discussed then. Now, I don't know how many people died in Mosul or in Raqqa, but we've heard a figure of 500 civilians being killed in East Ghouta. I've heard a figure which apparently is widely accepted, that up to 40,000 civilians were killed in Mosul. So when we talk about scale, let's be, I think, realistic about what these things mean, and also understand that this is perhaps not such an unprecedented event that we're seeing in the present conflicts in the Middle East.
Michael, what do you make of that? Because, it does seem that there is a bit of a double standard here, isn't there, Michael? Like, if the Syrian government fights terrorists and people are killed in that process, there is uproar. But then when, for example, the United States is involved in fighting terrorists somewhere and it kills several thousand, for example, there isn't as much uproar. There aren't emergency Security Council meetings being called for.
Right. First, let me say I have not heard any of those numbers about Raqqa and Mosul that would be on the order of 40,000 civilians dead in the siege and ultimate fall of ISIS on those particular areas. The numbers I've heard have been closer to maybe 5% of that number rather than something that astronomically high. But the point is still well made by my colleague, and that is that when you're fighting an enemy, an adversary that everyone, the world agrees is something that needs to be wiped off the face of the earth, completely annihilated, etc., the corollary casualties of war are more readily accepted and brushed aside against an enemy like ISIS than they are against a ragtag band of struggling and remaining rebels, which Syria has, understandably labeled terrorists, and which the West some understandably labels moderate freedom fighters. Nonetheless, they're nowhere near the threat to Syria at this point that ISIS was to the world, and so therefore the corollary casualties that happen when you're fighting against a group like ISIS become less of a screaming headline than they are today in East Ghouta because of the nature of the conflict, which is essentially a Syrian civil war.
All right, so Alexander, you well know that the Russians have come under a lot of criticism, especially at the UN, because Russia has said that the initial drafts of a resolution that are being put forward by Kuwait and Sweden were unacceptable to it because, it wanted guarantees that the other side, essentially the militants/terrorists, would respect their end of the bargain and not, continuing attacks on civilians in places like Damascus and otherwise. What do you make of that?
Well, I think what the Russians are saying, and I think they said exactly the same, incidentally, at the time of the fighting in Aleppo back in 2016, is that if you're going to talk about negotiations and humanitarian corridors and providing humanitarian relief, then you have to have a degree of reciprocity. You have to have both sides agreeing to some kind of arrangement to make that viable. When you're dealing with groups like Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda are not just a ragbag group of resistance fighters, they are one of the most powerful terrorist organizations on earth. They are the people who were responsible for the 9/11 attacks on the United States. When you're dealing with an implacable and ruthless group like that, negotiations which assume their goodwill and compliance with any ceasefire deal are frankly not going to work. So what the Russians are saying, I don't think this is unreasonable, and I think this is widely discussed, is that there has to be some kind of reciprocal arrangements so that the ceasefire is both balanced and enforced. Now, can I just very quickly say something about the casualty figure I mentioned in Mosul? That came from Patrick Coburn, who is a British journalist, citing sources within the Iraqi government. I don't know whether that figure I quoted is true, but Patrick Coburn is normally considered a reliable and authoritative source reporting events in the Middle East.
All right, so Michael, I wanted to get your reaction then. What do you think about the Russian concerns about the resolution as so far it's been presented at the United Nations? We know discussions right now, as we're speaking, are happening at the UN to try to convince Russia to sign on to some sort of a resolution. But what do you make of those concerns that, hey, the other side, we need some guarantees that militants/terrorists will be respecting the ceasefire as well, as they haven't in past ceasefires?
Right. Well, I don't think Russia's concerns are illegitimate. Certainly, there's a concern as to what the rebels and their associated terrorist friends will do if a ceasefire takes place. The problem is Russia is insisting that the United States and the West guarantee the behavior of these groups on the ground. And the United States at this point has almost no influence with them as to what they do under these circumstances. There can be no guarantees given. I would think the United States would be perfectly happy to encourage all parties concerned to honor the ceasefire. It includes not only a ceasefire and the allowing of humanitarian aid convoys to enter the area, but it includes also a no repositioning of forces, a no taking advantage of the ceasefire, a no intermingling the combat forces with civilian populations and things like that. All things the United States, I think, would enthusiastically endorse. The problem is there's no way the United States can guarantee that, and Russia knows it. And so the suspicion by the United States and the West is that Russia is asking for an unfulfillable promise to give the Syrian air forces time to continue to prep the battlefield to ensure that then when they launch the ground assault, everything will go smoothly. There's no other reason why they would be delaying like that I can see.
Alexander, do you agree with that? Do you think Russia is being unreasonable?
No, I don't think Russia is being unreasonable. I think Russia is being realistic. I think the Russians understand perfectly well that the United States has only a limited amount of leverage on some of these people in Eastern Ghouta. The point is that the Russians do not want to be in a situation where a ceasefire is agreed and a ceasefire then breaks down because these terrorist groups are not going to abide by it, and then almost immediately the United States and the other Western allies blame Syria and Russia for the breakdown of the ceasefire. What the Russians are looking for is an acknowledgement, a formal acknowledgement from the United States and from the Western powers that there are two sides to this conflict, and that the people who are driving the conflict in Eastern Ghouta are these terrorist organizations, which have been repeatedly called terrorist in United Nations Security Council resolutions, and which have been expressly excluded from being covered by ceasefires before, which cover de-escalation zones. And I think the concern the Russians have is that when they see resistance to this on the part of the United States and the other Western powers, they ask themselves, is it actually therefore that these proposals for ceasefires are intended to provide humanitarian relief, or are they intended to buy time to rescue and preserve these militant groups so close to Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, and where they can attack any part of Damascus? So one has to look at it from the Russian point of view, and I think it is a realistic one.
Michael, you know, that point that Alexander just made, a lot of people are putting that question forth, saying that, you know, is this more, or is this less really about humanitarian reasons and concern about civilians in Eastern Ghouta versus just protecting these militants, some of them who may be seen as quote-unquote moderate by Western countries? Because, you know, if it really was about protecting civilians, we know that the Al-Nusra Front terrorist group and others in Eastern Ghouta have in fact prevented civilians from leaving that region, which in fact the Syrian government had initially proposed, as did Russia. So, I mean, that leaves one to be quite suspicious, doesn't it?
Well, I think the resolution under consideration in the United Nations prohibits that. Is it enforceable? No. Human nature being what it is, would both sides tend to cheat on improving and advantaging their positions during a ceasefire? Yes, of course they would. But that doesn't take the focus off the fact that the humanitarian disaster that is unfolding in East Ghouta at this point is really astronomical, and it threatens to get so much worse because there just simply are no medical facilities left, and the bombing is no longer just in waves. The bombing is now 24/7. And if we're right that the bombing is only in preparation of the battlefield for a ground invasion, it will get worse, and there will be no humanitarian aid allowed in there and no food allowed in there for weeks at this point. And what will happen to the civilian population under those circumstances is simply unfathomable.
Michael, if I could stick with you, because, you know, the West is not at this time condemning the militants and terrorists in Eastern Ghouta for using civilians there as essentially human shields. Why are we not seeing a more balanced view then on what's happening in Eastern Ghouta?
Well, I think there's some dispute as to whether or not they are using them as human shields. You know, there hasn't been a lot of reporting that I've seen that has said that the civilians who are taking the casualties are doing so because rebels are holed up in their houses or the house next to them or something like that. It's just that civilian areas are being bombed. Where I think the criticism of the rebel forces and the associated terrorist friends that they have should be loud and strong is there is evidence, I think confirmed evidence, that they have been launching missiles and artillery into civilian areas of their own that are held by Syrian government forces. That ought to be roundly condemned, strongly condemned, because you can't play one side and not the other side on that. If you're criticizing one side for indiscriminately hitting civilians, the Syrians and the Russians, then you have to hold the other side accountable as well.
So, Alexander, you know, as Michael just put it, we have not heard that kind of balanced talk, really, have we, from the West, even at the United Nations. You know, even Russia has said there's been misinformation campaign, specifically, of course, about Eastern Ghouta. We can stretch that to all of Syria, really. Why is the existence of these terrorists and their activities, their use of human shields, their attacks against civilians being ignored, really?
Well, it isn't a balanced approach, and it is being ignored. And if I may talk about reporting, one of the problems, of course, is that we're not actually getting a great deal of reporting from Eastern Ghouta because there are no Western journalists there. And the reason there are no Western journalists there is because they wouldn't survive very long, given the kind of people who are there. The logical way to go forward would be for a United Nations Security Council resolution to require these organizations, the people who make them up in Eastern Ghouta, which are terrorist organizations, to leave. If that was part of the UN Security Council resolution, then we would have a more balanced resolution and we could start to work somewhere with this. But what we have instead is a resolution which puts all the emphasis on the bombing by one side, which is the Syrian government side, and which is in effect acquitting responsibility of the other. And simply saying, well, we cannot control these people, doesn't really help in a situation where all the blame and all the responsibility is being put on the one side.
All right, so we're quickly running out of time, so I wanted to get both of your final thoughts, if I may. Michael, I'll start with you because, you know, a U.S. official, Michael, speaking, I think it was today or yesterday, spoke about the situation in Eastern Ghouta and says it shows, and I'm quoting him now, the failure of the de-escalation zones agreed upon in Astana, and he said that those de-escalation zones have become a farce. Now, that's an interesting statement in my mind, Michael, because, you know, Astana, many people celebrated because that was the only seemingly successful de-escalation zones and ceasefires that have been able to, you know, brought forth in this entire crisis in Syria. Do you think the United States doesn't really like that process because it's not involved? So it wants a process where it's involved, and it only wants that to really succeed.
No, I think it's a fair statement that the de-escalation zones have been turned into a farce. I mean, look what's happening. That's clearly not what a de-escalation zone was for. So it's a very legitimate comment. But I think what's happening, you know, if we can take a look at the bigger picture, 2 years ago, President Assad and his government were really on the ropes. It was on the precipice. It was teetering. And in the last 2 years, it has really been one amazing achievement and victory after another for Russia and Syria together, and Iran as its partner, and the militias that are partnered with it, and stuff like that, to the point where President Assad is literally on the verge of reestablishing, if not control over his entire country, only because it's so big and he can't occupy the whole thing, but he's on the verge of almost complete military victory against the forces that have been against him for the past 7 years. This is an astounding accomplishment from where he was 2 years ago, and I think it gives insight into why Assad is working so hard now. He's willing to suffer the bad public relations and suffer the attendant criticism for purposes of just annihilating the opposition at this particular time, which is what I think he's doing.
Alexander, I'll give you the quick last word. Do you think the de-escalation zone in Eastern Ghouta has become a farce?
Well, it's not a farce. The problem is, the reason it's never worked is because the de-escalation zones were never supposed to be hiding places for terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda. The problem is that the people who were supposed to help to get them, so to prevent them becoming hiding places for terrorist organizations, the people Michael Lane calls the moderate opposition, have never really worked to achieve that. They've never separated themselves from Al-Qaeda and from the groups that involve themselves with Al-Qaeda, and they've come under no pressure to do so, either from the Western powers or from their Arab backers. And until that starts to happen, the de-escalation zone concept can never really work.
Right.
And that is why we're seeing the fighting in East Ghouta.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there at that as our final word. But of course, gentlemen, we appreciate both of your contributions to tonight's discussion. That was editor-in-chief at theduran.com, Alexander Mercouris, who is speaking to us live from London. And we're also joined by the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy, Michael Lane, who is speaking to us live from Washington, D.C. And of course, viewers, we appreciate you joining us as well. Until next time, good night.